Man, it is so sweet to worship together. It is so sweet to open the Word together and see what God has for us today. And I'm excited to be sharing with you all here today. My name is Randy. If I don't know you, I'm one of the pastors here on staff. And thrilled to be in this series, King Jesus. And we are looking at him today, and it is going to be so sweet to see his character, his nature, and his love unfold. So like I said, this series, this King Jesus, Jesus is King series, over the weeks, we've seen that Jesus has invited us to see that he is king over sickness and disease. We have seen that he is the king over our fears and anxieties, that he is the king with power granting authority, that he is the one with all the power, and then he's empowered us. And then we have a king who actually loves us, and he loves to say, "Here's more of my love." If you weren't here, I apologize. That's weird if you weren't here, but you could go online and look at that last message. But here's more. I'll work on that impression. We'll do it again some other time. Jesus is amazing. And if there's anything else you get out of this series, know he is just so amazing. He is so patient, and he is so intentional, and he is interruptible. All these things is the nature and character of Jesus, and it is so sweet. So grateful for Mark reading that passage there. In Matthew, we're going to be in Matthew chapter 11, at the very end of 11, and then looking at through chapter 12, verse 13 today. I'm going to read here just this first part, because this is where we're starting and this is where we're ending. We're going to start here and we're going to end here, which is verse 28. It says, he just read it there, but it's, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart. You will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." All right, if I could just have life group leaders come forward. We're just going to jump straight to invitation time. That's good. I'm not really. Somebody's going to jump up. Yes, let's worship. Isn't this what our souls need? Another version is like our weary souls need rest. And today we're talking about that Jesus is the king of the Sabbath. He is the Lord of the Sabbath. And so he's inviting us into a place to see his authority again, but also inviting us to say, hey, if we have burdens, if this yoke doesn't feel easy, then something's off on our side, because he says it's easy. And he is inviting us to rest. Jesus is the king of the Sabbath. He is the rest giver. And I had this thought as in this series, but also recently, just maybe in the past year or 2 years or something, I love that we teach the Bible. Like I know there's so many churches that do that, but I love that we read the Bible, that we look at this, we try to discover what is this teaching us about Jesus and how do we want to live as we read this. And I love that. I just want to thank you, Jesus, that we get to do this. In verse 1 of chapter 12, and it'll be up here, I'm going to walk through. We're going to kind of walk through this passage and ask, okay, what does this teach us about Jesus, and how does he want us to live? And so you can follow along with me here. At this time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, so they began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. But when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." Now, if you've read with us here in Matthew, or maybe you've read any of the Gospels and you see the Pharisees, it's like the Pharisees have nothing better to do than just try to annoy Jesus and catch him doing something wrong. Like, I just picture them as I was reading this, like in the corn, in the wheat field, just waiting, like, what is he going to do? And they're like sneaking, and they're like, they see them grab some wheat and eat it, and they pop out like, "Gotcha, you can't do that." It's like, this is the nature of the Pharisees. And then I'm curious who was on duty for the Pharisees watching Jesus that day, They like take shifts. It says, "Look, your disciples are harvesting grain on the Sabbath." Now, I'm also imagining it's Peter, by the way. I don't know, Peter always gets in trouble. I picture him the one like grabbing the wheat, and the Pharisees mad at Peter all the time, Jesus has two responses to this, and we'll look at this in this passage. This is what Jesus responds to them saying, hey, you can't do that on the Sabbath. Look how Jesus responds. He says to them, have you not read what David did when he was hungry and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who are with him, but only for priests. So David goes into the temple. He eats the bread of presence. This is bread specifically set aside. It's not for him, it's for the priests. So he broke the rules, and then he even gave some of the bread to the people that were with him. So Jesus uses that as an example. Then in verse 5, he says, have you not read in the law how on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are guiltless? Because what it's saying there is saying the priests in the temple, they have priestly duties they have to do. Like they have responsibilities, like refilling all the bread that David ate. You know what I mean? They have like things they have to do. They have to like refill everything. And so Jesus uses these examples that totally just go over the Pharisees' heads. They have no response. There's nothing that they have to say. You know, like the Pharisees I could see as like super annoying, but Jesus is so patient towards them. He's actually trying to help them understand something really big here. And you could see it as you read how patient Jesus is with them. He tells them what David did. He tells them what the priest did, and then he communicates who he is, and they have a hard time understanding. In verse 6, he says, I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. Something greater than the temple is here. And he's talking about himself. It's like, I'm actually greater than the temple. Verse 7, he says, if you had known what this means, so this is another thing he's referencing here. If you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would have not condemned the guiltless. What Jesus is doing here is actually quoting Hosea 6:6. And this is something that they should know. He's saying, this is God talking to Hosea, and he's writing this down saying, I desire mercy or steadfast love and not sacrifice. This is like a big statement that he's making. And Jesus just goes for it with them. Like he tells them, and they don't understand. They are just not on board. They were complaining about him working on the Sabbath. Then he started talking about the temple, something they're like, where did that come from? They don't understand. And then he uses examples where he uses the example of David. He uses the example of the priests. And they know these examples. They know what David did. They studied the Old Testament. They know the passage in Hosea. They know that. They learned it like in Saturday school, which is like a Sunday school, but it's like the way that they did it back in the day. Saturday school. You guys had Sunday school, right? Okay, no, nobody did it. Great. No big deal. But as I was pressing in this week, I was like, Lord, what do you want to teach us? So I know there's an invitation at the very beginning that God wants us to enter rest, but there's something about his authority that he's establishing as he goes into the place of saying, I am the Lord of the Sabbath. And so what is he's actually wanting to teach us? So when you look at why did Jesus use this example of the temple, why is this such a big deal? Why would it be a big deal to them, and why would it be a big deal to us? And it's because the religious spirit of the Pharisees loves to make some places more highly spiritual than others, right? They like if David goes in the temple and does this thing, that's a big deal. It's like some of you younger kids, maybe this isn't, none of you in here, never mind, but other kids that go into Walmart and throw a fit. It's like, okay, we can handle it at Walmart. We can handle it. Public, don't make a big spectacle in public, kids, you know? Like, but if you act up in church, that's a big deal, right? I mean, you got to like, what I heard for a long time, be on your best behavior. You guys heard this before? Nobody? We be on your best behavior. It's like, hey, like that's because God lives there. That's his house. That's God's house. And so if you go into God's house, you better make sure that you act perfect, right? And this, of course, was a challenge. You know, it's like just a moment of confession here. We just had communion. This is a good moment. I did get in trouble quite a bit, but mainly it was like falling asleep. You know, falling asleep was a big deal. And the worst was looking behind you, like just turning around and looking behind you. And I'm sure I just was doing it way over the top, probably making faces, but I got in trouble for that. But just to break that religious spirit, can you guys all just turn around and look behind you real quick? Just turn around. But see, What's confusing now is like you just see the back of people's heads. I apologize. Didn't think through that one. That didn't work out. Every other row look behind you. No, I'm just kidding. It's fine. Just forget about it. Just forget about it. And then there was, I'm sure there was other things. I didn't do like a cannonball in the baptismal, although I always wanted to. Did like crawl through air ducts and get in big trouble. Back then a pastor would whip you. I don't know if you know that, but like so you got to be careful. But there's something that Jesus is trying to communicate, and it is him establishing his authority, that he is actually he is more valuable than what the temple was. And that there's this religious idea of, hey, there's a spirit superiority or a hierarchy of how you should act in different places. He's kind of breaking through that boundary as he talks about the Sabbath. And then he goes on in verse 8. He says, for the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. And what he's saying is, I am the Lord of the Sabbath. And they need to know this. So the three big statements that he makes here, he says, one, I am greater than the temple. Second is this, God doesn't want sacrifices. He prefers love and mercy, quoting from Hosea. And the third is, I am king over the Sabbath. Now, a lot of this went over their head, but they were still mad. You ever get like offended, but you don't really know why? That's what happened with them. Jesus says all this, and then later, right there in verse 9, he just walks off and goes into the synagogue. I can just imagine, just picture with me, like these Pharisees, this religious spirit in them is like, okay, we still got to try to get him, but the Sabbath thing didn't work because he always talks about things we don't understand, so we got to try something else. And then just they kind of gather together, but then they walk in the synagogue behind Jesus and they see a guy with a crippled hand, and they just know the character of Jesus, that when he sees somebody in brokenness, he loves to make things right. And so before Jesus does anything, the first thing they say is, can you heal on the Sabbath? Is that okay? Like they're testing him again. But this is how the Pharisees work. Is it a verse 10? Is it okay to heal on the Sabbath? And I'm like, come on, like really with this? Jesus is so patient, and then he gives them things that they can understand a little easier. So he tries to help them again, and he says, which of you, in verse 11, which of you who has a sheep, if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, would not take hold of it and lift it out? If your sheep falls into a ditch, wouldn't you get it out? Isn't he, and he's talking about the guy with the crippled hand, isn't he more valuable than a sheep? And then he heals the guy, and they, in verse 14, they just kind of like, they want to destroy him. Do you read the verse? They conspired against him how to destroy him because he heals this guy on the Sabbath. Man, Jesus is establishing his authority, and he's inviting them and the disciples all to know who he is, what his character is, and then what is the actual way to rest. What is this? Here's the challenge that we have. Here's for us today. I want us just to look, and I want to just if we can get a picture of how did the Pharisees actually miss it. So we want to see Jesus as the Lord of the Sabbath, and we need rest for our weary souls. And so if we need him, he's revealing it, and we don't want to miss it. So I asked the question, how did the Pharisees miss it? And I believe that they didn't know, understand, or accept that Jesus is who he says he is. They didn't know, they didn't understand, and they didn't accept that Jesus is who he says he is. And for us today, do we? Like, do we know him? Do we accept who he says he is? And do we understand? Are we in that place of understanding where we're like, he is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, and I believe it? And this is the question we have. Do we accept, know, and understand who Jesus is, who he says he is? Just felt like, man, we need to know this, that in him, and this is in Colossians 2:9, it says, for in him dwells the fullness of the Godhead bodily. He is the very expression of God. He is the very expression of God. Another way I like is like this. It says, Jesus is exactly what God has to say about himself. You want to understand something about Jesus? You want to understand something about God and how the Holy Spirit works? Jesus is exactly what the Godhead has to say about itself. And so as we look at who he is in this passage and what he's trying to teach us, we know that he is God. He is the King of Kings. And he is the embodiment of the Godhead. A few of the things, these statements that we looked at a second ago, I want to just kind of walk through some of this. And he says that he is greater than the temple. So when we look at this, we know that Jesus says, okay, that there's somebody that's greater than the temple here. And so the question of, okay, what are you saying, Lord, and how does this play out? And it's true that Jesus is, he is greater than the temple because he is God, and the temple was set up to be able to worship God. So he is the very nature and character of the Godhead bodily. And so wherever he goes, the presence is. And so the temple, yes, to say that the temple that he's bigger than the temple is an understatement. He is the presence of God. He is God. And then in 1 Corinthians 6, we hear that Paul tells us that we are the temple of the living God, that we actually have the Holy Spirit living inside of us. The second thing that he said there is about sacrifice. He tells them that God loves steadfast love and mercy over sacrifice. And it's so easy to think, and I think he's addressing the Pharisees for this specific reason, and I think this is for us as well. It's we have this idea of God that his favorite thing is probably sacrifice. He wants us to sacrifice. That's what he wants from us. That's what he wants from us. If we can prove that we are worthy through sacrifice, then we'll make him happy. And it also makes us look really good before others. And as I was just Lord, okay, what is it about sacrifice that really stands out to us today? What do we need to know? And I was looking back even at the whole system of how sacrifice worked. And I looked at the story of Cain and Abel. The story of Cain and Abel, God actually didn't come to them and say, hey, I need you to make a sacrifice to me. That was something they did on their own. And then I'm like, okay, Lord, where do you start? Where does it kind of switch to where you start speaking the language of the sacrifice language? And then you look at even the story of Abraham. The story of Abraham where he says, hey, I need you to go and you're going to sacrifice your son. The whole message of that story was not, Abraham, you're going to have to sacrifice your son. It's actually, no, Abraham, you need to know it's not you that's going to have to sacrifice your son. It's actually me. That's the story. And God is establishing that I am not like all the other religions that did sacrifice at the time. That's actually not what it's like. You're not going to have to sacrifice your son. I'm going to sacrifice mine. And so we cling to this idea and historically in this culture of saying, hey, God prefers sacrifice. He wants it from us. There's something that we need to give up. And I think what Jesus is doing here, he's just saying, hey, there's actually a better way. There's a higher way that he's modeling. God always goes after the heart. He always goes after the heart. And the Pharisees and many religions over the years have taught that there's this in this sacrifice, there's a superiority. There's a superiority. And even sometimes we can get caught up in the idea of, hey, all of us, we need to be very uncomfortable. We need to make ourselves very uncomfortable because we don't want to get too comfortable. And I think there's something in us that says, if I get comfortable, then I'm not sacrificing enough, which is confusing because he actually gives us a spirit that's named Comforter, right? This is his very nature. He comforts us. Now, maybe the blinders need to be lifted. I need to realize that actually never brought me comfort. Maybe that's it. Maybe the false sense of comfort is the problem. But he is the one that's comforting us. He is the one that's guiding us. He is the one that's giving us life. And so just trying to make ourselves more uncomfortable and sacrifice all of that might not be what he has for us. I heard this story years ago, and just it popped up this week in my mind. I was like, okay, so you maybe heard this, but there's a monk, and he goes to a monastery, and when he goes to the monastery, if you've heard about some of these monasteries, man, it's pretty intense. They go to the monastery, they have to crawl up the stairs on their knees, and then every day they would do penance every day, and so they would take a whip or something, and they would whip themselves. So at night, if you walk through the halls of this monastery, you would hear the whipping sound and just yells. Ah, just screaming. I didn't bring a whip. Sorry, you wanted an illustration. But they're whipping themselves with this, right? And they're just shouting out, like just shouting out. And one guy in particular is louder than all of them. I mean, the dude is, you hear the pop, and he's just screaming at the top of his lungs. You hear another pop, and he just goes on and on and on. And then one day, after this happens for a while, and this guy's like congratulated, like, hey, man, you're really going after that penance that you're doing is really awesome. Somebody walked into his room in the middle of one of these sessions of penance, and the guy is just banging the whip on the bed, sitting by the window smoking a cigarette. You know, and it's like he was the one who was just whipping himself so bad, and it turns out it was not. It just was fake. And there's something that we celebrate, or that's tempting to celebrate when we see somebody really, really sacrifice. And I'm not saying that God doesn't call us to that. There's a place of intimacy. We just got done fasting and praying and like seeking God, and there's things like that kind of peel away on some of our perspectives of comfort. But I'm telling you, what he desires is steadfast love and mercy. And he says to them, he says, if you would have had that, you wouldn't have judged the guiltless. If you would have had that, you wouldn't have been judging the other people, because you see yourself as sacrificing more than them, so you get to call them out, and you get to be superior to them because you would never pluck wheat on the Sabbath. And it just seems so silly. As he establishes his authority, he says, I am the Lord of the Sabbath. I am the Lord of the Sabbath. The Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. And so as we look at this Sabbath, if he's the Lord of the Sabbath, and that's what we're talking about, I just want to what is the Lord saying to us about the Sabbath? What is he saying? The Sabbath is a verb. Sabbath is a verb, and it actually means to rest. There's multiple aspects of this we could see. As you study it out, you could see. It's not just rest in the sense of not doing anything. That's really not the language there. It's not doing anything. It's a set-apart time for intimacy with God, contentment, and time with family, intimacy with family. So this was an expectation. We see God actually modeled this in creation on the seventh day, where he rested, and he was like, it is good, and he rested. And then we see it later on actually given to Moses as one of the 10 commandments. He instituted this as a command to Moses. But it wasn't until Moses that we actually see this command. We see God model it, but then we don't see it until Moses. So now the Israelites and Moses follow this Sabbath day, keep it holy. They start following this. This was given to them by God. And the question of, okay, what was unique about them in this time that God said, hey, I need you to rest? And when you look at it, you see that this command came out from the people of Israel being in slavery in Egypt for hundreds of years, working tirelessly. And this is a gift that God gives them. He says, I have a gift for you. It's called rest. And it's going to be with me, and it's going to be with family, and you're going to be content. And I'm inviting you to this place of rest where it gets manipulated and changed by a religious spirit. It was originally just, you are invited in. You get to enjoy this. It was made for them. The parallel passage in here is Mark chapter 2. And in verse 2, chapter 2, 27, it says, the Sabbath was not made for man, but man for the Sabbath. Now, if it was made for rest, for reflection, and intimacy with God, then the disciples were honoring the Sabbath in a higher way than the Pharisees could ever understand. Like, they're with Jesus. If it's about intimacy with God, if it's about being near to him, if it's about resting with him, like, you're with the model of rest. You're with the model of rest. You're with the one who is peace. And they are closer to understanding and experiencing true rest than the Pharisees could ever even understand. Jesus is King of the Sabbath. And he actually still invites us to walk with him on that. He's inviting us in to walk with him. And I believe that even now, the Sabbath is still a gift that we inherit. I think it actually is for us. He set it aside for us, and he's inviting us to take hold of it. The Pharisees missed it. They missed it. And I feel like Jesus is inviting us in to see him for who he is. They went to the temples constantly to worship God, right? You remember they would go to the temple, they would blow a trumpet or something as they gave, and then they would go and they would worship the presence of God, but they missed that they could actually become the temple of the living God. It wasn't just a surface level. It didn't have to be just a surface level thing from a distance. The presence of God could live in them. They hustled around all day trying to catch Jesus, breaking the Sabbath, missing the rest that they actually needed. They hustled around trying so hard to catch him in some kind of mess up, missing that the need in their own heart could have been satisfied in him. They were still slaves to the law, missing the freedom that stood before them. In this passage, I think we can, I've heard, and there's a bunch of different thoughts on Sabbath and rest, and there's some really great resources. But when we look at this, Jesus is not coming out of the gate anti-Sabbath, just to be clear. This is not what he's doing. It's not about that. I believe that Sabbath was God's response to a major cultural problem that the Israelites inherited as they were in slavery. And when they came out of that slavery, they need to be reminded they are no longer slaves. And what you toiled for in the past is not what you're toiling for now. There's actually freedom granted. And in that freedom, my presence is there with you. And you need to stop and remember that you're not a slave anymore. They needed rest. And we need rest. We live, this isn't Egypt, and this is not that whole time period, but we live in a culture that values and even rewards restlessness. And it's not much different. It's not as different as you might think than Egypt. And it doesn't mean, I'm not saying hey, you need to stop being busy. I have 5 kids and we have all kinds of stuff going on, I feel like, all the time. So I think busyness is a slippery slope. I think it does need to be submitted. But I would say, okay, it's not just so much that, but it's planning for rest. It's holding it dear, saying, hey, our souls need this, and being aware. And you even have to fight for it. Tomorrow, Thomas is going to be doing an equipping. He's going to be talking about talking about the Sabbath. He's talking about rest, and then giving a lot of practicals and books and resources on, hey, how do we be a people that enter his rest? And that room should be packed. We should all desire rest for our souls and understand, hey, this is how I fight for it. This is how I learn deeper how to rest in him. And rhythms of rest are important. So how do we walk with Jesus and combat restlessness? We want to combat restlessness. How do we do that? I believe Jesus is teaching us in this passage. Somebody else said this. I don't know who this is, but I liked it. It says, if you want to experience the life of Jesus, you have to adopt the lifestyle of Jesus. And Jesus was constantly at rest. Even in a boat, in a storm, he was sleeping. He was constantly at rest. And he's inviting us to that level of rest, to that level of peace, to that level of trust. I love that Jesus knows, we have chapter 11 towards the end of that, and about people coming. He says, come to me, that whole part. And then he goes into 12. He knows, and it's so sweet that we get to see this before we even read this whole passage. And we're going to go into this moment here and look closely. What is it that Jesus is inviting us into? What does the Lord of the Sabbath want us to do in response? What is our response here? And who is he in this? In verse 28, he says this. He says, come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. Learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart. You will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Take my yoke upon you. He says, take my yoke upon you. Learn from me. Learn from me. So the language here is attach yourself. Attach yourself to him. Attach yourself to Jesus. Who is it? Let's see this. Dallas Willard said this. He used an example, and I feel like maybe I've heard it, but if you've ever seen a horse-drawn carriage and you've got two horses and you have a new horse and like it's a young horse and it just got broke and they're trying to get it saddled up to get it to pull a carriage with an older, more mature horse. What happens is they load up the new horse and they saddle them up and they yoke them together. That's what that is. They're connected together. And that young horse, for a while, will pull as hard as he can. And the young horse, the new horse, to this whole idea of being attached to somebody else, will work extremely hard, way harder than it needs to, while the older horse is like, sweet. I love having these young horses come over and be yoked with them because they want to pull so hard and pull everything. And then eventually the young horse learns, hey, if I just match pace with this other horse, this is so much easier. Isn't that a sweet picture for us? Like, man, if we attach ourselves to him and we go at his pace, then we learn that he knows where he's going. He knows where he wants to lead, and he's leading us to places of peace that we're not the ones booking it as hard as we can, trying to pull him. We're actually he's like so kind and gentle on the journey. Take my yoke upon you. Learn that he is gentle. Learn his gentleness. He is gentle and humble. With Jesus, the slave mentality and striving cease. Like those don't have to work. One of the greatest motivators in the world system that we see is fear. Fear is a fantastic motivator in the sense of that it controls so many different things. But when you see Jesus as gentle, or you see God in heaven as gentle, it's something about that changes. Like we might think of God like an Egyptian taskmaster where he says, hey, I need you to do this. I need you to make bricks. So go make bricks. And then you get done. You're like, okay, Lord, I made bricks. He's like, all right, now I want you to make bricks without straw. And you're like, okay, I'm going to do it because you said. And we have this picture of God as not gentle. And Jesus is telling us, he's saying, you need to know, I am gentle. I am gentle. And the way that he leads us is gentle by his Spirit. He's guiding us this way. Then he says, I am lowly in heart. Or another way to say that is I am humble and easy to please. I'm easy to please. And if the King of Kings is saying he is easy to please, then why is it in us that we have to convince ourselves that we have to strive to please him? Why do we have to try in our minds? Because I don't know if we feel, and I mean, trust me, I know this feeling of like, I don't know if I'm worthy of that. I don't know if I feel worthy of the love that you're saying that he loves us, he's gentle, he's easy to please, and man, sometimes it's so hard to wrap our mind around the compassion and love of Jesus, but this is what he's trying to tell us. For a long time, it was hard for me. It was hard for me to see that what I was producing in my life, because we all have things we produce. We all have things that come out of us, whether it's our jobs, whether it's our family, whether it's our life, whatever it is that you do. We all have things that we're producing, and it took me a long time to see, but what I was producing was a fruit of restlessness. What I was producing was a fruit of restlessness. And I'm just determined in my heart that, hey, man, Lord, help me abide in you in such a way and know this about you and believe this about you, that what's produced in me is a fruit of abiding, not restlessness. He's inviting us to abide. He's not inviting us to strive. He says that his yoke is easy and his burden is light. His yoke is easy and his burden. I don't know about you, but life doesn't always feel light. Like sometimes it just doesn't feel this way. Like the Bible can handle this. Jesus can handle this. It doesn't always feel light, Lord, so what's up? Like parenting is hard, right? Growing up, for some of the young kids in here, like, hey, growing up is hard, okay? Cut yourself some slack. It's actually pretty hard. We remember, don't we, all of us old people? We get it, okay? It's hard. Getting older is hard. Getting older is hard when you like hurt yourself sleeping and sneeze that goes sideways and you're like, oh, like getting older is hard. So, but he says it's light. His burden is light and his yoke is easy. He's teaching us something here. That even in a broken world that is really sometimes hard to deal with, He's reminding us of the gospel that says, yes, it is hard, but you are not alone. You are yoked to the one who's overcame the world. And as we trust where he leads and we go at his pace, and he makes a way where there is no way. And he's guiding us into these places of peace and love and joy in him, even when it doesn't make sense. Even when it's not our natural default. It's a grace that comes from him. I'm so grateful. I'm not in charge of where this leads. And I'm telling you, when you get to that place, you're like, so that level of surrender is like, okay, I want to do the best I can, but I'm actually not in charge of where this leads. Like, I'm going to be obedient to the next thing, but man, he has got bigger plans than me. And so I'm just surrendered. That's so freeing. I'm attached to the one who's been here, who knows what's best, and I have seen his faithfulness release peace and guide my soul to rest, so many people to rest, and he's guiding us into that place, even in the midst of really hard things. The last point here is this, and it's where he starts. So really, I just declared who he is. So what is our response? In this, what is he actually telling us to do? And it's this first word in verse 28. He says, come to me. These first words. He says, come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, or all those who labor, and I will give you rest.